Welcome back to Crime Documentary Files. In today's video, we'll explore two heartbreaking cases that occurred within the Vietnamese community in North America. One took place in Milpitas, California at the end of 2024, and the other in Prince Rupert, Canada, in mid-2023. Both share a tragically similar pattern of family violence. In the eyes of neighbors and friends, these were happy, loving families that everyone admired. So what really happened behind those closed doors? At the end of 2024, as the holiday spirit filled the air throughout Milpitas, a peaceful suburban city nestled in the heart of Silicon Valley, a horrific tragedy was quietly unfolding inside what appeared to be a completely ordinary apartment. News of the incident spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through the local community accustomed to its tranquil way of life. But what stunned people even more than the tragedy itself was the true identity of the perpetrator. When police officially announced their findings, no one could believe what they were hearing. The person responsible wasn't a dangerous criminal with a prior record, nor was it some mysterious intruder or robber. It was a familiar face, someone everyone thought they knew well. It all began on the evening of Tuesday, December 17, 2024, when Milpitas police received a request to conduct a welfare check at an apartment in the Touring Apartments complex, located at 1355 McCandless Drive. The call came from relatives of the apartment's residents, a Vietnamese couple named Vinh Quang Nguyen and Betty Pham. The family had reached out to police because for 3 straight days, they hadn't been able to contact the couple by any means, whether by phone calls, text messages, or social media. What made matters even more alarming was that both Vinh and Betty had failed to show up at their workplace, the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, since Monday of that week, without any prior notice or explanation for their absence. This was completely out of character for them, as both had always been regarded by colleagues and supervisors as exemplary employees who were diligent and highly responsible. The fact that both had suddenly vanished without a word when they had always maintained regular contact with family and friends left everyone deeply worried, so they called the police. When officers arrived at the apartment, they rang the doorbell and knocked multiple times, but there was no response or sound from inside. Left with no other option, they had to use a spare key provided by relatives to enter the apartment. The moment the door cracked open, an unusual and unpleasant odor drifted out. The officers switched on their flashlights and began moving cautiously through each room. As the light swept across the dark corners, a scene of horror gradually emerged before their eyes. In the master bedroom, a woman was found lying motionless on the bed, a fatal gunshot wound to her head, blood long dried on the pillow and sheets. Moving to the smaller bedroom next door, the scene was even more heartbreaking. 2 children, a boy and a girl, were also found deceased in similar positions. The apartment, once a family's home, was now shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. Not a sound remained, only the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air and shell casings scattered coldly across the floor. Continuing their search in the living room, officers discovered another body. It was a man, slumped over in an unusual position. Notably, resting neatly on his right thigh was a 9mm handgun. Upon closer inspection, police observed that the man had 2 gunshot wounds to the head, an unusual detail compared to the other 3 victims, each of whom had been shot only once. This immediately raised questions among investigators about what had actually transpired. Based on the condition of the bodies, initial assessments indicated that all 4 victims had died several days before being discovered, as their bodies had begun showing early signs of decomposition. Another significant observation was that the crime scene showed no signs of disturbance to household items, nor any indication of a struggle between the victims and the perpetrator. This led to a chilling conclusion. Everything had likely happened extremely quickly, so fast that the victims had no chance to react, resist, or even flee from danger. Based on preliminary forensic examination and confirmation from family members, police quickly identified the victims. They were husband and wife Vinh Quang Nguyen and Betty Pham, along with their 2 young children. A family of 4, once known as loving and happy, was now gone forever. Immediately after confirming their identities, police began processing and analyzing the crime scene. The 9mm semi-automatic handgun found next to the husband's body quickly became the focus of attention. Examination confirmed that the gun's caliber matched exactly with the bullets recovered from all the victims' bodies. Combining this crucial detail with Vinh Quang's position at the time of death, where he was found with the gun resting on his leg, investigators began piecing together a chilling scenario. According to the emerging theory, this was most likely a case originating from within the family, where the perpetrator had killed his loved ones before taking his own life. In other words, the prime suspect in this case was none other than the husband and father of the family. The hypothesis was that Vinh Quang had shot his wife and 2 children first, then used that same gun to end everything. However, despite the initial evidence pointing toward one conclusion, authorities remained extremely cautious in their official statements. Police indicated they needed to thoroughly review all collected evidence before reaching any final conclusion. This caution was well-founded, as according to their records, police had never received any reports of domestic violence or serious conflict from this apartment. No prior history, no warning signs, no cries for help from the victims. This detail made the case even more baffling and deeply shocking to the community. People couldn't understand how a family that seemed so normal, even happy to outsiders, could meet such a tragic end. Clearly, the true motive behind the perpetrator's actions remained a major unanswered question. Therefore, the investigation quickly shifted focus toward gaining a deeper understanding of relationships within the family, particularly the suspect's psychological and mental state in the period leading up to the tragedy. Immediately after the discovery, the Milpitas Police Department worked closely with the Santa Clara County Medical Examiner Coroner's Office to conduct a comprehensive and thorough investigation. The primary objective was to reconstruct the entire sequence of events, from what happened inside the apartment to what caused this heartbreaking tragedy. Initial forensic examination results confirmed that all 4 victims died from gunshot wounds to vital areas of their bodies, entirely consistent with what investigators had observed at the scene. Based on the decomposition state of the bodies and various other technical factors, forensic experts estimated the time of death to be the previous weekend, most likely Saturday evening, December 14, 2024. This assessment matched perfectly with information provided by family members who said they had completely lost contact with the family since that evening and couldn't reach them by any means afterward. Thus, it could be concluded that the victims had remained in the apartment for approximately 3 days before being discovered on the evening of Tuesday, December 17th. Alongside the autopsy work, trace evidence and physical evidence at the scene were also collected and examined meticulously, leaving no detail overlooked. The 9mm handgun recovered from the apartment became the most important piece of evidence in the case. Upon checking weapon registration records, police confirmed this was a gun purchased and legally registered under the name Vinh Nguyen, the husband in the family. Additionally, the scene review revealed no unfamiliar fingerprints or any DNA samples belonging to anyone outside the family. All doors and windows showed no signs of forced entry or unauthorized access. All these details combined further strengthened investigators' initial assessment that the person who caused this horrific tragedy was most likely not a stranger but a member of the family itself. Police then seized laptops, cell phones, and electronic devices from the apartment to determine whether the suspect had left a suicide note or any other clues. However, the initial examination revealed no such letter. In the following days, police interviewed people who knew the family to understand the motive behind the incident. Relatives of Vinh and Betty revealed that the couple had been in the process of divorce proceedings and had been quietly living separately for some time. According to family members, Vinh Nguyen had recently shown signs of severe depression and frequent insomnia, particularly after the marriage began to fall apart. Notably, not long before the incident, Vinh had purchased a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, the same weapon recovered at the scene. This information alarmed investigators, raising the question of whether everything had been planned in advance during a state of hopelessness and despair. A records check showed this family had no history of domestic violence or any legal violations in the area. Vinh Nguyen had never been questioned by police or reported by neighbors for any unusual behavior. This meant the tragedy occurred almost completely without warning, showing no clear signs to those around them. Ultimately, based on all collected evidence, investigators concluded that Vinh Quang Nguyen was the perpetrator who shot his wife and 2 children before taking his own life in the apartment. The investigation found no evidence suggesting outside involvement, and the case was closed with the determination that this was an internal family tragedy. On December 19, 2024, the Milpitas Police Department held a press conference to announce preliminary investigation findings, confirming this was an isolated incident and emphasizing there was no other threat to the community. Although the perpetrator's identity had been established, the question of why behind these actions continued to trouble even the most experienced investigators. To better understand the psychological factors and context related to the cause of this tragedy, police also worked to build profiles of the victims. According to investigation results, Betty Pham, whose full Vietnamese name was Chow Bao Pham, born in 1988, was identified as the central victim of the incident. Those who knew her described her as a capable and warm-hearted woman. Within her family, Betty was always a devoted daughter, while in society, she was a dedicated colleague and sincere friend. At work, Betty left an impression with her professional demeanor and tasteful dress. Many colleagues still remember her as someone who was always well put together, even remarked upon as always being the best dressed in the office. One colleague once shared that Betty was not only a devoted mother to her 2 children, but also like a loving mother to anyone who had the chance to know her. Indeed, with her caring nature, Betty was always ready to look after her loved ones and help anyone facing difficulties as if they were her own family. Before the tragedy struck, Betty was living the simple life of a mother of 2. She skillfully balanced her time between work and caring for her small home. Friends said Betty loved her husband and children dearly, often sharing her joy about Henry's academic achievements or Shelby's innocent sayings. Few could have guessed that behind that gentle smile, Betty might have been quietly enduring cracks in her marriage. According to information released later in the investigation, an important detail emerged about the couple's marital situation. At the end of 2024, Betty and Vinh were in the process of divorce proceedings. Although specific details about the cause and progress of their separation weren't publicly disclosed by authorities, it was clear that their nearly 15-year marriage hadn't been as smooth as it appeared on the surface. Behind the apartment door, the couple had faced numerous conflicts, disagreements, and tensions that had quietly built up over the years, ultimately leading to the decision to go their separate ways. Those close to Betty all described her as a mother who was completely devoted to her children. Therefore, one can imagine how much Betty must have agonized and suffered at the prospect of her family falling apart, at the prospect of her children having to grow up in a home that was no longer whole. As for the husband, who was also the sole suspect identified by investigators, Vinh Quang Nguyen was born in 1988, a man of Vietnamese descent with a tall build and a face that appeared kind and approachable. In the eyes of neighbors living in the same apartment complex, Vinh was simply an ordinary husband and father like many others. He showed no signs of aggression, hot temper, or psychological instability that would have caused concern. According to available information, Vinh and his wife both worked at the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, specifically at the Valley Transportation Center. At their workplace, both were regarded by colleagues and supervisors as hardworking employees with a strong sense of responsibility. From the outside, Vinh Quang Nguyen's life seemed quite peaceful and enviable, with a stable job ensuring steady income and a small family complete with a beautiful wife and well-behaved children. However, behind that calm exterior were silent upheavals that few could recognize. According to records from the Santa Clara County Medical Examiner's Office, by late 2024, Vinh Nguyen was documented as being in a state of depression. Family members reported he frequently suffered from insomnia and showed clear signs of declining mental health, likely due to the heavy psychological impact of his marriage falling apart. During this time, vague worries seemed to consume Vinh's mind. He feared losing his home and not being able to be with his children anymore, or simply felt a sense of failure and hopelessness about life. Rather than seeking psychological support, Vin chose to withdraw, silently suffering through his prolonged sadness. Family members said their concern for Vin had been growing in the weeks before the tragedy occurred. Notably, during this same period, he had suddenly purchased a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. For someone who had never had any habit of collecting or using firearms, this action made relatives uneasy, especially as it coincided with a time when Vin's mental state was seriously troubled. According to investigation results, Vin had no criminal history or violent behavior. The Milpitas Police Department confirmed they had never received any information suggesting domestic violence in his home. This indicated that if there were conflicts within the family, everything had occurred in silence and was never reported to authorities. Asian cultural values may have led the couple to keep their problems private rather than seek outside help. Additionally, Vin had no official psychiatric medical records. His previous depression was only described as an unstable state, so he had never been required to undergo mandatory treatment or participate in counseling. Any signs of instability, if present, occurred quietly behind closed doors, only noticed by family through his prolonged insomnia and increasingly evident sadness. Later, many people who knew Vin expressed shock when recalling the incident. They couldn't believe he could have taken such extreme action, as in everyone's eyes, Vin had always been gentle and showed no clearly abnormal behavior. Yet perhaps it was precisely those pressures suppressed over such a long time, combined with the inability to share his struggles, that had silently accumulated, pushing this man to his breaking point and leading to a tragic decision. Since the suspect died at the scene, this case was permanently closed without any criminal trial or sentence being carried out. Nevertheless, the pain left by this incident still lingers within the community. The victims' families had to face an enormous loss. The second case occurred in a small neighborhood in Canada. Late on the evening of June 13, 2023, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police stationed in Prince Rupert suddenly received an anonymous emergency call. Without a moment's hesitation, officers immediately headed to the reported address, house number 100 on Silverside Drive, a quiet street in the town's peaceful residential area. At that moment, no one could have imagined that this seemingly routine call would open an investigation that would shake the entire small town for months to come. When the first officers approached the scene and stood before the house, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The front door was locked tight from the inside, and there was no sound or sign of anyone living inside. The silence enveloping the house was suspicious, so heavy that even these experienced officers felt uneasy. After knocking and calling out multiple times without receiving any response from inside, the officers decided they couldn't wait any longer. They had to break down the door to enter the house. The moment the door swung open, in the flickering dim light from the faintly lit bulbs, a scene so chilling it raised goosebumps appeared before the officers' eyes. Right in the middle of the living room, 4 bodies lay motionless in pools of dried blood, a sight so devastating that even these battle-hardened officers stood frozen for a moment. Immediately, urgent requests for backup crackled rapidly over the radio, summoning additional personnel and specialists to the scene. This marked the beginning of an investigation of unprecedented scale in this peaceful little town. Stepping inside the house, the police officers noticed something strange. All household items remained neatly arranged, everything in its proper place with no signs of disturbance or ransacking. However, the scene in the living room told a completely different story. A woman lay sprawled near the sofa, her body bearing severe wounds that had taken her life. Right beside her, a man had collapsed in an unusual position, as if he had fallen right where he stood. Not far away, on the carpet, 2 little boys lay completely still. The tragic scene was so heartbreaking that even the most experienced investigators who had witnessed countless crime scenes had to fight back tears. Looking at the scene before them, everyone shared the same sorrowful thought. The victims appeared to be members of a small family, parents, and 2 young children. From initial observation, investigators noted that the house showed absolutely no signs of forced entry from outside. All doors and windows remained intact, with no prying marks or signs of unauthorized access. Additionally, valuable items in the house, such as electronics, jewelry, and money, remained untouched. These details virtually eliminated the possibility that this was a robbery homicide. Most notably, near the man's body, police discovered a handgun lying among some small debris on the floor. The position and manner in which the gun was found immediately raised suspicion among investigators that this was very likely the weapon used in this horrific massacre. Immediately after discovering the 4 bodies at the scene, the police's top priority was to identify the victims. At the scene, investigators quickly found identification documents for the 2 adult victims. The documents clearly showed the woman's name as Janet Nguyen, born in 1988, and the man as Christopher Duong, born in 1985. Based on the estimated ages of the 2 children at the scene, along with information from household registration documents found in the house, police determined the 2 boys were the couple's children. For additional confirmation, investigators checked a cell phone recovered at the scene and found many photos of the happy family together, confirming the relationship between the 4 victims. The older boy, about 4 years old, was named Alexander Duong, while the younger one, about 2 years old, was named Harlan Duong. By June 15th, after completing necessary verification procedures and contacting family members living far away, police officially announced the full identities of the 4 victims in this tragic case to the public. Identifying the victims opened an entirely new investigative direction for the case. Instead of focusing solely on physical evidence at the scene, investigators now began delving into this family's life, exploring potential conflicts, their relationships, and anything that might be connected to the incident. Investigators interviewed neighbors, friends, colleagues, and relatives, trying to reconstruct a complete picture of their lives before the tragedy occurred. All with the hope of finding answers to the agonizing question the entire community was asking. What exactly happened, and what led a seemingly happy family to such a devastating and heartbreaking end? Janet Thi Nguyen, 35, and Christopher Minh Duong, 38, were a Vietnamese-Canadian couple who had lived and built their lives in the town of Prince Rupert for many years. They had been married for quite some time, and together built a small family with 2 adorable sons. Janet was born in Canada, in a Vietnamese family belonging to the first generation of immigrants to the country. Growing up between 2 cultures, she maintained Vietnamese traditions while integrating well into life in her second homeland. Everyone who knew Janet described her as a cheerful, open, approachable woman who was completely devoted to her family. She owned and operated a small hair salon in town. Thanks to her skilled work, dedication to customers, and friendly, welcoming personality, Janet was beloved and trusted by many clients. Her salon gradually became a familiar destination, and Janet herself became a well-known face not only among the small Vietnamese community in Prince Rupert, but also among many other local residents. On social media, Janet frequently shared images of her family's daily life. Her account was filled with photos of her 2 adorable sons, warm and happy moments with her husband, and weekend outings with the whole family. Just about 2 months before the tragedy struck, Janet had excitedly shared a series of photos capturing the family's joyful vacation in Cancun, Mexico. Looking at those beautiful, vibrant images, no one could have imagined that those would be the last memories captured of this small family, the final happy moments before everything was forever sealed in tragedy. Janet's husband was Christopher Duong, 3 years her senior. Like Janet, Chris was of Vietnamese descent, but had lived in Canada since he was very young. For work, Chris was in the import-export industry at the port of Prince Rupert, one of the major seaports on Canada's west coast. His stable job with good income not only ensured his family's livelihood, but also allowed him time to handle household matters and spend plenty of time with his 2 young sons. Beyond his main job, Chris nurtured a special passion for photography. Among friends and acquaintances, Chris was described as a gentle, calm man, somewhat introverted and quiet, but someone who always put his family above everything else in life. In the eyes of neighbors and friends around them, Janet and Chris's family was always seen as an admirable model of warmth, happiness, and harmony. They were a young couple who loved each other, raising 2 well-behaved children together and building a stable life in this peaceful little town. Not one person among those who knew them ever thought there could be any serious conflict or concerning signs between the couple. Their image in everyone's eyes was of a close-knit family, full of warmth and actively contributing to the community. Because of all these good things, when news of the horrific tragedy that befell their family spread, many people in town were utterly shocked and found it hard to believe what they were hearing. The official investigation was launched that very night of June 13, 2023, with the Northwest Major Crimes Unit joining the effort. After preliminary examination of the scene, investigators' initial assessment was that the house showed absolutely no signs of external intrusion. All doors and windows remained intact, with no prying marks or signs of unauthorized entry. Therefore, the investigation quickly focused on the possibility that this was a homicide occurring within the family. Scene analysis showed the victims were not in the same location when the incident occurred, suggesting events may have unfolded rapidly with multiple successive developments. For the two boys, wounds were found concentrated in the head and chest areas, characteristics of close-range shots that caused nearly instantaneous death. For the wife, Janet, her body had a bullet wound through the back, leading investigators to conclude she was likely attacked suddenly, possibly while trying to move or instinctively rushing to shield her children. As for Chris, his body had a wound to the right temple, with a contact-range shot to the head, a characteristic injury pattern commonly seen in cases of self-inflicted gunshot wounds. From these initial analyses, a hypothesis was formed. Investigators believed that husband Christopher Duong had suddenly opened fire on his wife and two sons on the ground floor of the house, then took his own life with that same gun. However, this was only a hypothesis, and before reaching any official conclusion, investigators needed to thoroughly examine the gun recovered at the scene and conduct careful autopsies. Immediately, the gun was sealed and sent to the forensics lab for experts to compare with bullet wounds found on the victims' bodies. The ballistics examination results that came back confirmed something crucial. All bullet wounds on the four victims' bodies were fired from the same single gun, and that was the gun found right at the scene, beside Chris's body. Furthermore, on the gun's grip and trigger, police found clear fingerprints belonging to Christopher Duong. Additional testing also revealed large amounts of gunshot residue on his hands, a telltale sign of someone who had recently fired a weapon. With this compelling chain of physical evidence, investigators were nearly certain that Chris was the one who held the gun and fired it in this horrific case. Alongside analysis of physical evidence collected at the scene, authorities also conducted meticulous and thorough autopsies to determine the exact cause and time of death for each victim. Following the examination, the forensic pathologist concluded that all four victims died from gunshots to vital areas of their bodies. Based on the condition of the bodies and various medical factors, time of death was estimated at approximately dawn on June 13, 2023, just a few short hours before police discovered the scene that evening. This finding played an important role in strengthening the timeline investigators were building for the case. However, to complete the full picture of what happened that fateful night, investigators realized they still needed testimony from witnesses. They began contacting and interviewing everyone who might have relevant information, from neighbors living right next to the house, delivery people who regularly came to the area, to friends who had been chatting online with the victims in their final days before the tragedy. Some neighbors, when asked, all said they hadn't heard any gunshots or unusual sounds in the early morning that day. They explained that everyone might have been sound asleep at that time, or perhaps the distance between houses in the area was quite far, combined with the possibility that the gun had a silencer attached, so the shots weren't loud enough to wake anyone. However, an important witness emerged, a newspaper delivery driver working the early morning route. He recounted that around 5 a.m. on June 13th, while driving to deliver newspapers and passing through the area, he heard a small bang, sounding like a firecracker. However, since there was only one sound and everything returned to quiet afterward, he didn't think much of it and continued his work. From the testimony gathered, the investigation team realized they needed to shift toward searching for indirect clues to verify additional information. They proceeded to review all security camera systems in the vicinity of the victim's house, hoping to find valuable footage. Fortunately, investigators discovered that a camera mounted on the smart doorbell of the house across from the victim's home had captured some images from the early morning hours that day, though the quality was quite blurry due to low light conditions. After carefully reviewing the footage, police noted that throughout the period from 4 to 5 a.m. that same day, the camera recorded no unfamiliar figures entering or leaving the victim's house. No one approached or left the house during the time frame believed to be when the incident occurred. The only notable thing appearing in the frame was the light inside the victim's house suddenly flickering on for a moment, then turning off again and plunging into dark silence. Beyond gathering witness statements and checking security cameras, electronic data from the victim's personal devices was also extracted and carefully examined by investigators. This was an important source of information, helping them better understand the victim's moods and activities in their final days before the tragedy. Analysis results showed that on the night of June 12th, just hours before the incident was believed to have occurred, Janet was still chatting via text messages with a close friend. The conversation revolved around plans to take the children out that coming weekend. The last message Janet sent was recorded at 10:30 p.m., and the tone was cheerful and relaxed, just like any other day. Meanwhile, Chris's phone showed no unusual communications that night, but his internet search history caught investigators' particular attention. Through data analysis, they discovered that in the week before the incident, Chris had spent considerable time reading news articles about similar family murder cases, instances where husbands or fathers killed members of their own families. More alarmingly, he had also accessed some online forums where people discussed these dark topics. Such searching and reading behaviors were assessed by criminal psychologists as signs that Chris may have been secretly harboring negative and dark thoughts for some time before taking action. As all the puzzle pieces of evidence gradually came together to form a complete picture, investigators finally reached a heartbreaking conclusion. The perpetrator of this horrific massacre was none other than Christopher Duong, the husband and father of the family. The scenario established was that Chris had opened fire, killing his wife Janet and their 2 young sons, then took his own life with the same gun that caused the tragedy. With all physical and electronic evidence pointing in a single direction, police decided not to pursue any additional suspects. However, due to the extremely sensitive and tragic nature of the case, specific details of the investigation results were not immediately released to the public. Instead, the entire case file was transferred to the coroner's office to prepare for a public inquest hearing. At this point, the truth of the case had been nearly completely clarified from a legal standpoint. The perpetrator had been identified, the sequence of events had been reconstructed, and the physical evidence all aligned with investigators' conclusions. However, behind those numbers and dry facts, there remained haunting questions that would likely never receive complete answers. Why would a husband and father known for loving his wife and children so dearly do something so cruel? What was going through his mind on that fateful night? From the outside, Chris's relationship with his family was always assessed by everyone around them as harmonious and peaceful. Throughout their years together, there was never any evidence or testimony suggesting Chris had ever abused his wife or children, whether physically or emotionally. Janet had never once reported to authorities or even confided to close friends about being mistreated by her husband. Because of these seemingly contradictory factors, the true motive behind Chris's actions remains a major mystery, a question that will likely never have a completely satisfactory answer. After carefully considering all available data, investigators put forward 3 main hypotheses about potential underlying causes that may have led to this heartbreaking tragedy. The first hypothesis, which many criminal psychologists assessed as most plausible, was that Chris had silently fallen into severe depression and developed distorted, warped thoughts about life. According to this theory, Chris may have suffered from serious depression for a long time, feeling hopeless and desperate about work and life, but due to his introverted nature and not wanting to burden anyone, he chose to keep everything bottled up inside, not daring to share with his wife or anyone else. In such a suppressed and distorted mental state, Chris may have developed an extreme and pathological thought that if he had to leave this world, he wanted to take his wife and children with him to a place he believed would be better. The second hypothesis was that Chris acted in a sudden fit of rage as a form of revenge against his wife. Although no concrete evidence was found, investigators didn't completely rule out the possibility that hidden conflicts existed between the couple that outsiders never knew about. Perhaps Janet had mentioned wanting to separate or had another romantic relationship outside the marriage, making Chris feel betrayed, resentful, and losing control, thus leading to extreme actions. However, this line of reasoning received the least support from those who knew the family, as not a single relative or friend of the couple had ever noticed any signs that Janet was having an affair or intended to divorce. Most firmly stated that until their final days, Janet and Chris remained a happy, loving couple. The third and final hypothesis related to the possibility that Chris suffered from delusions or was affected by serious mental health factors. This is a fairly rare case but not unprecedented, as history has recorded some family murder cases where the perpetrator was determined to be in an acute psychotic state when committing the crime. In such a pathological state, the person may hear voices that aren't real in their head, urging them to harm loved ones to save them from some imaginary danger, or they may believe their family is being controlled by some evil, supernatural force. In Chris's case, there was no clear or specific evidence that he had ever been diagnosed with a mental disorder or shown signs of delusion before. However, this is also very difficult to verify with certainty since he was no longer alive for experts to conduct necessary psychiatric evaluations. After weighing all factors and available information, the most credible possibility remained the first hypothesis. Most likely, Chris had silently fallen into severe depression for a long time without anyone knowing, accompanied by increasingly growing negative intentions, and finally, the decision to take his entire family with him. Pressures from work, financial burdens, the responsibility of being the family breadwinner and raising two young children may have silently accumulated and weighed on Chris's shoulders for many years. And when everything exceeded his threshold for endurance, tragedy struck. Therefore, Chris's true motive most likely stemmed from the combination of untreated depression and distorted, warped thoughts about love and family responsibility. According to the reconstructed sequence of events from investigators' analysis, on the evening of June 12, 2023, the Duong Nguyen family may have been going about their normal routine in their small house on Silverside Drive. But behind that calm exterior, dark thoughts had been forming in Chris Duong's mind for many days before. Perhaps he had been drowning in feelings of hopelessness and disappointment with himself due to some kind of pressure. Around 4 a.m. on June 13th, Chris quietly got up while Janet was still sound asleep, unaware that her husband beside her was walking toward the gun cabinet, and the tragedy began from there. The first victim may have been Janet, awakened by a strange noise. Before she could realize what was happening, she saw her husband holding a gun in his hands. In that horrifying moment, Chris pulled the trigger and the first shot rang out in the silent space. Although the gun may have had a silencer attached, the action still woke the two children. At this point, Chris had completely lost control and continued shooting at his children, despite Janet's desperate attempt to shield them with her last ounce of strength. When all fell silent, Chris closed out his crimes with one final bullet for himself. The entire tragedy unfolded in just a matter of minutes. After about 4:30 a.m., the house remained in silence for many hours. Outside, dawn gradually rose over peaceful Prince Rupert, with no one knowing that inside that house, 4 lives had been lost. Janet and Chris's phones kept buzzing with text messages, calls, and work emails, but no one answered. It wasn't until that evening, when an acquaintance noticed the unusual silence, that they called the police. The case closed with 4 deaths, but no one truly knows what happened. Everything can only be reconstructed through traces, deduction, and the scant clues investigators managed to gather. In this case, since the perpetrator had died, no criminal trial was opened. Instead, justice was carried out through a coroner's inquest. The purpose of the inquest wasn't to determine guilt, but to clarify the truth and provide recommendations to help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The tragedies of both families quickly sent shockwaves through the Vietnamese community while drawing significant attention from local media. The press described these as family tragedies that could have been prevented. This sorrowful assessment also serves as a reminder about the importance of caring for mental health and safety within every family. And those are the two cases for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next videos.